doing? Welcome to this week's Griscom stream. Happy to be here as always. Hope you're doing well wherever you're at. Got a lot to get to today. We're going to be talking a little bit about the madness of the Texas GOP convention over the weekend. We'll also be talking a little bit about Colombia and the elections in France as well. And as always, for folks, this might be your first time, these are more casual than the main show. And we're taking questions from the chat, so always happy to answer, within the realm of reason, any questions that you have. But yeah, we got some fun stuff coming up for y'all next week. Hopefully we're going to be joined, it got delayed a little bit, but we're going to be joined by Lee Phillips to talk about austerity in the Green movement, some of the major criticisms of that growing and very dangerous movement, as well as a defense and an explanation of nuclear power. I'm really looking forward to sharing that with all of y'all, as well as a really great interview that we just did recently with one of the organizers of the successful Starbucks union campaign right here in Austin, Texas. So some really great advice and just some stories to help people understand what goes into that process, both the ups and the downs. Really happy to do that. And this weekend, Sunday, for patrons, we're going to be joined by Andrew Perez of the Lever News, formerly the Daily Poster, to talk about Joe Manchin. So really looking forward to that. You get access to that, patreon.com/Left Reckoning. Yeah, folks, very happy to maybe start off with a couple questions before we get into these stories. I know Strom has a question for me about music, and I'm going to disappoint you right now. I don't really have a very good encyclopedic knowledge of guitar players and bands like that. I know which songs I like, and maybe I have a better memory for stories that I hear about folks than I do for those kind of, music history and things like that. But yeah, let's see. We got some things we can get to. Let's wait a little bit on the Texas GOP thing, and maybe we can start. Let's start with France, because I think we're going to have a little bit more to say about Colombia. And again, as for folks who are just joining us, feel free to jump in the chat with any questions or comments or topics you might want to hear us discuss here. But on France, I want to start here because we're really excited about this opening for Mélenchon, who represents the real left-wing movements in France after the implosion of the Socialist Party and the marginalization of a lot of the other left parties. Mélenchon has sort of charted out a different path to challenge not only Macron's just anti-worker, hyper-neoliberal politics, but also the very frightening and real threat of the far right in France, led by Marine Le Pen. So if people remember, there was the presidential election in France, where Mélenchon came close to making it into the second round, but lost just slightly to Le Pen. And then, for a lot of people, it was one of those things where it's a forced choice if you're voting. A lot of people voted for Macron, not because they support Macron, but because they were trying to block or vote against Marine Le Pen becoming the president of France. So Mélenchon got together with some of the other left parties and organizations in France with this idea that the French system is different than ours, and typically they have their presidential election and their elections for the lower house legislature after the presidential election. So typically, what ends up happening there is that whoever wins the presidency then gets the swing in their favor in the legislative elections. So typically, they're able to rule without having too much opposition within the legislative branch of government. But Mélenchon made this argument that, a lot of people are voting for Macron, not because they like Macron or like the austerity and the anti-worker policies that he's been pursuing, but because they're so afraid of the far right movement led by Marine Le Pen. So Mélenchon came up with a slogan that was effectively like, you voted in the first election against something. Now this is your chance to vote for something. And there was a lot of hope that Mélenchon and this coalition of other left parties that he created might actually be able to win the lower house and make Mélenchon prime minister, which would give him tremendous amounts of power, not only to block Macron, but actually to do their own legislation and start fighting for working people in the country. They did very well by most standards, but they didn't win outright. Macron's party took heavy losses, but they're still the largest party in the lower house at 245 seats. Now, they don't have an absolute majority, which means that they're going to have to compromise with Mélenchon and the leftist coalition in France. Mélenchon's coalition was able to pick up 131 seats. But it's also notable that Le Pen's far-right party also rose and ended up holding up 89 seats in the lower house. And this is certainly a huge rebuke of Macron and his really, really nasty neoliberal. I mean, Macron really is representative of neoliberalism's next chapter, particularly if you look at his environmental policies, where he's trying to say, oh, we need to do something about climate change. But the policy front, the payment for that movement and that change is all on the backs of workers. And you saw the outrage at that with the Yellow Vest movement, which was challenging Macron's very, very anti-worker programs that were putting huge tax burdens on working people, which is something that undoubtedly is going to be coming to the United States and the United Kingdom in the near future, right? This is how neoliberalism wants to deal with the climate crisis, is to put the onus of pain and suffering on working people and not the massive corporations that have profited from the destruction of the planet. But there's a lot of trouble for Mélenchon, even though that there's this opportunity now that they can really slow down the worst of Macron's policies, particularly his move to lowering the retirement age, to extending, raising the retirement age in France. Which would mean people have to work longer and they get less access to their pensions that they've worked their whole lives for. So Mélenchon now has the ability to block a lot of Macron's policies, and potentially, if they're able to get buy-in from maybe some of the more centrist parties and even some of the left parties that are outside of the coalition, they might be able to push through some stuff, but it's an uphill battle. And worryingly, despite creating this really historic coalition, the Socialist Party, the Green Party, and the Communist Party in France have rejected Mélenchon's call for them all to sit as a unified bloc in the lower house. So, better result than Macron having another term where he effectively has unlimited and unobstructed power, but not the end result that we wanted. It doesn't mean that the entire model needs to be scrapped, but it wasn't in the end, completely successful in their goals. And the rise of the far right in France is extremely worrying, not only for French citizens, but I think for people across the globe, because this kind of far-right threat is now becoming a permanent fixture in a lot of politics in both the United States and France and Europe in general. And it comes out of the failures of neoliberalism. It comes out of the failures and the co-optation of the social democratic socialist parties. But it is something that seems like it's going to be with us for a while until we're able to find these kind of electoral moves that are able to bring us into power and having the ability to be able to legislate and undo the extreme damage that we've been experiencing and working class people have been experiencing for a while. And devastating, on a particular level, because Mélenchon had promised, if he were to become prime minister, that he would make Julian Assange a French citizen and give him a Medal of Honor. Which would have been a very helpful thing, as Assange, as if you watched our episode yesterday, we were talking about Chip Gibbons, is now facing extradition to the United States to be tortured for exposing American war crimes. But let's see what y'all are saying in the chat. I'm happy. These are always best when it's more of a conversation versus me just coming at y'all. It's an interesting comparison. France and America aren't so different. Biden and Macron not too dissimilar in that regard. I mean, I think certainly in the sense of their ideology being one that is so rooted in neoliberalism, and like defining that for a second, look at how Biden is dealing with this gas price crisis. he's doing like these kind of private, like, please, ExxonMobil, will you not charge so much money for gasoline? Or this new scheme, which is like, oh, they're going to lower the taxes on gasoline, which again is just such a neoliberal mindset because it misidentifies the problem here. The reason that gas is expensive in this country is not solely due to what is it, 18 cents gas tax that we have in this country. It's because these corporations run on a for-profit basis, and despite the fact that they're making record profits, despite the fact that they have incredible access to wells in this country and to an international market, they're not investing in production or in refining. They're taking the money that they're getting from these windfall profits and they're moving that money right back into the hands of their shareholders or shoring up their financial position, so that their company looks like it's a better place to invest and stock your money away. Right, like that's where the crisis is in the gas. That's the source of the gas crisis in this country. It's corporate greed. It's a private system of ownership that doesn't serve social good or social needs. And like that's a very neoliberal way to attack it. Say, well, the problem here is that these corporations and there's too many taxes on things. Which I mean, I would prefer for the things that are necessary for life to be given, if not at a reduced cost or for free for working people. It's not the taxes that is creating, $5-6 prices a gallon for gasoline. It's a very, very clear example of corporate greed. And, even like the EIA, which studies the gas industry here, is saying that, right? That's like somebody who's very much in a neoliberal model. Macron certainly runs from that, comes out of that tradition as well. But I think Macron is very different from Biden in the sense that he's trying to create a new synthesis. I don't think people believe it as much now. But remember when he first got elected, it's like, this is the future, like a young, different thinking kind of progressive voice. And you've seen in power, he's been somebody who has been most interested in shoring up French capital and making France attractive destination for international capital to come into. So I think that they're certainly, they're on the same team, no doubt about it. They do come out of different schools. And I think it's notable to see what this next generation that inherited like the world and the ideology from people like Biden are doing with that. Let's see. Also, if people missed yesterday, know that this podcast is now officially a Mick Lynch fan podcast. And we're very happy to take any submissions of good videos that you see of him in the UK just absolutely bodying Tory, right wing, and even Labour Party folks over the next few weeks as they're doing this fight in the UK, which has been so inspiring for all of us. I mean, I think what we're seeing on the gun control front after the Supreme Court ruling and also things that come out of Texas is that, no, I mean, it seems like the federal policy here is going to be extremely hampered for a while. What do the smaller left French parties hope to gain by denying a coalition? Well, I mean, the reason that they're doing it is because they want to maintain their independence from Mélenchon. I mean, that's it. It's a gambit that maybe one day they'll become the majority party in the coalition versus Mélenchon's unbowed party. And yeah, I mean, it's frustrating just because one thing that was really encouraging in the early days of this coalition was that, okay, you're going to have a united left movement so that you're not seeing this fracture in the vote share. But you see that, like, even within that coalition, it doesn't seem like it has the sustainability to be able to withstand even defeat. And, the French political left has been a disaster for a while now. It started truly with Mitterrand, who was like the great hope of a kind of democratic socialist movement in the 90s. And he ended up putting in extreme austerity into place in France. And it shows a few things about some of the limitations there. Was that France in that position was sort of they were in a tight spot with their relationship with global capital, which is why Mitterrand did that. But it was nothing short of a capitulation that I think set back that movement for decades. And then, of course, that party, the Socialist Party in France, just continues to move more towards neoliberalism and centralism, and it's not not centralism, centrism, really, really embodied by the absolutely pathetic figure of Hollande. So there's a lot of people right now who think that this could be their opportunity, to basically shore up and become the next voice and vehicle of the left in France, which is why some of these smaller parties are standing up. And like Green Party in France is similar to Green parties throughout Europe, which is like very bourgeois. They're interested in environmentalism, but they're interested in a kind of latte sipping environmentalism that won't go very far and is very often antithetical to the needs of working class people. So you're seeing that's not really a movement that is going to win back traditional left wing communities. The Socialist Party has just completely imploded, and Mélenchon's been trying to pick up the pieces. But there's just extreme fragmentation right now, and it's tough to build momentum, top loss after loss. Am I having a bit bad sound here? I hope not. Well, I hope that fixed it, y'all. Apologize for that. Sometimes it sucks. I don't have a way to check my sound before I go live. Um, this was good. Daredevil says Mick Lynch. Piers Morgan was very funny. His Facebook profile pic is a supervillain from a '60s kids puppet show. So Piers like had a whole. I saw this clip. Piers had a whole hissy fit about Lynch basically presenting himself as a villain, and does he think of himself as a villain? Which is, I mean, that's just pure Piers Morgan fodder. But Lynch just doesn't play the game here, and that's why he's so refreshing. Frankly, has been a really inspiring figure so far for all of us. Um, where would you put La France Insoumise in relation to the Communist Party? I mean, I think that Mélenchon's movement is much more of like a left populist movement. It certainly comes out of a French radical socialist Marxist tradition, but it's not as hardline as the French Communist Party. And the thing is with a lot of those older communist parties that were very influential in a period of time, um, they've struggled to maintain their membership, particularly post Soviet Union. There's been a lot of fracturing. Certainly, a lot of stuff happened in the '60s and '70s that fractured those movements. So ideology wise, I mean, immediate program stuff. I think that Mélenchon represents a much more kind of democratic socialist to radical social democratic position, while the Communist Party holds on to like a much more traditional hardline 50s, 60s style Communist Party politics. But I'm no expert in French politics, so I don't want to speak too much out of class on that. But that's just my general understanding. Um, Javier has a question here. Do you think Biden's, at least on speeches, not so much policy support of unions, has been helpful at all in the United States? Is that at least setting the ground for improvement? And like that's an interesting question because Matt and I have called Biden the press release president because he likes to talk a certain way and do something very, very different. And that's been like the entirety of his politics, which is why he had all those embarrassing articles from people on the left at the beginning of the Biden administration, basically arguing that he's some second coming of FDR, which he wasn't and will not be. Because he's too beholden to financial interest and capital at large to be that kind of transformational president. I mean, like, so there's certainly that, but Biden also like has like, and this is honestly maybe one of the better things about him, like enough of an ego that when people like Bezos and Musk start challenging him publicly, he likes to rely on, he likes to take shots at them, and that's why he had his hilarious line on Musk, about going to the moon. Um, is it important that he's like outwardly supportive of unions? I mean, I think yes, just in the sense that if you're going up against a big corporation like Amazon and you see that Biden is meeting with Chris Smalls, even though those meetings are certainly symbolic, Biden's commitment is very, very weak. As like a spectacle, media spectacle for folks, it does make it seem like there's attention being paid to this issue. There's the possibility of protection or action, even if like the reality of that might be slim. That certainly, moves the ball forward. But I wouldn't trust him at all, or think that we could ever rely on Biden really intervening. He's been fairly timid on that, other than those kind of very general, you know, pot shots at Bezos and Musk, or those kind of symbolic meetings like with Chris Smalls in the White House. But I think that those have value, especially if you're an organizer, to show like this is how important we are. This is a national movement. People are paying attention to it. So I think that it certainly has a place. If I was in a union position, I would deny a meeting with Biden because it shows that the government is seeing that they have to take stock of you and take interest in what you're doing. So um, I think that that's certainly beneficial. All right. Tony Rizzo says, "How do we best signal to our reps and movement leaders that we want them to address the media the way that Mick Lynch does?" Well, I mean, I think the harsh reality that is like you're just not going to get somebody. You can't become Mick Lynch just by changing your persona. I mean, look how just like opposite spectrum, right? But look at how all these guys in the Republican Party started trying to mimic Trump mannerisms and stuff like that. Very inauthentic, goofy. Like you're not going to be able to coach that into somebody. Um, the thing about Mick Lynch, I mean, this is somebody who was on national TV and was asked about who his political heroes are. He says James Connolly, like the great Irish Marxist and revolutionary, right? That's somebody who's from the movement, from inside of it, understands it, feels it, and wants it to be successful. And the fact is that he's authentic because he is authentic. And in this country, a lot of the people who do get those spots, apart from a few examples, um, really aren't as invested in it, at least in a kind of militant radical way, like Mick Lynch is. So I think that if you want that we need to be building, to use a phrase we use a lot on the show, class rooted versus class focused movements, because you can't recreate that kind of authenticity. It will always ring hollow. You can be a good speaker, um, but that kind of pugnacious attitude and real desire to just cut through the BS is something that I think only comes from somebody who's been fighting as long as Mick Lynch has been. Magitacker says, "Where do you stand on whether the Fed will get spooked and start cutting rates again before the market crashes?" Uh, just today, or maybe it was yesterday morning, Financial Times says that it's signals from the Federal Reserve that they're looking at another rate increase. So I don't think that we're going to see cuts anytime in the near future. I think that they're pretty committed to this plan at this point. Good to hear from our friends in the UK as well. Nowhere Newsman says good evening from London, everybody. Thanks for staying up with us, and hope you've been supporting the RMT in your own way. Sean Moon says, much in the same way Clinton and Gingrich collaborated to impose austerity with welfare reform, Biden will help Republicans to massively cut Social Security and Medicare. That's why Biden got elected. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see if he's able to push through cuts like that. I don't think it's the top of his agenda, but I think in the reality of a very likely Republican sweep of Congress, Biden might try to third way it and say, "Oh, well, we had to do cuts, but we met them in the middle," which is a very, very dangerous situation when you're playing with a party as rabid as the Republican Party right now. Why is there a reluctance to take on a positive and explicit stance on a one-state solution for Palestine? And it depends who you're talking about. I mean, assuming you're talking about elected officials. I mean, I think it's because a lot of them, you know, there's ideology and then there's politics, at least in the game that we're playing right now. And I think in the same way as like we were talking with Chip about Julian Assange yesterday, a lot of these people, they don't see any upside in doing it. And you have to remember that, most people who get into politics are extremely selfish individuals, and they need to start seeing a benefit from promoting, pro human rights policies like that. And we're not going to get that until the movement's strong enough to be a force. And the fact is that there's a tremendous organized, moneyed, organized money and basically flooding, particularly like Democratic Party, but also Republican Party primaries with the stipulation that you have to take a very, very hard line, Israel only approach to politics. And, we can condemn people for making that bargain because it's anti-human and wrong and wicked. But we have to build up our capacity where our phone calls are the ones that are being picked up. And, that was one thing that I think is something worth noting on the Bowman situation. No defense of Bowman, his position, especially being out of step with the movement, that was successful in bringing him into power, is inexcusable, right? But like the facts of the matter, the rules of the game here is that his office was getting call after call after call from people, are demanding that he take a pro-Israel position, and he wasn't getting those same kind of calls from people, demanding that he takes up a human rights centered approach to the issue. And like, again, it's like we can condemn, and I'll get mad as hell on this program, and we can be rightfully outraged. But eventually, like if we want these things to change versus us just being right about them, we need to understand that like here are the power dynamics at play, and how can we defeat our opponents politically. And that's certainly it. And also, I mean, it depends on what country you're into. In the UK, certainly there's been a really successful movement. Not that it hasn't been in the United States either, but a successful movement to demonize any kind of pro-human rights, pro-Palestinian human rights position as being anti-Semitic, and that's going to be something that's going to take a while to claw out from. I think it has been very brave and correct of people to just flat out deny, not accept that kind of framing. But obviously, it was successful enough to force Corbyn out of his position. So I'm not an expert on Biden's Social Security advisory boards, Jules, so I can't answer that off the top of my head. But it's very worrying. I mean, there's no doubt about it that there's a lot of push and momentum on these moves to privatize or at least limit Social Security, which would be so devastating to generations of people. Tom Nook Yankees says the problem is that as the far right media ecosystem grows bigger and bigger, it moves the Overton window of the neoliberal media with it. That's why the media ecosystem has to be eliminated ASAP. Yeah, I mean, it's worth noting that like Fox News, one of the more popular news networks in the country, I think beyond it just being like the Overton window necessarily, you also have to remember like the class position of the people who get into decision-making positions in the media are people who come from a very small world, a very elite world, a very wealthy world. And even if their positions, like they might consider themselves on the left, they consider themselves on like the, cosmopolitan New York left, right? Which is much more about signaling certain things than it is about improving the lives of working people. And like when you don't have class politics in a situation where there's class war that's ongoing and is affecting every aspect of our lives, the only thing that you can do in media is to do culture war stuff, is to do geographic kind of politics, right? It's like, oh, what do people in West Virginia think, as if that's like an entirely unified block, right? The difference between like a West Virginian, there's a wide difference in opinion on what should be done from a working class West Virginian and a ruling class West Virginian. But all these things have to become flat if you can't do class analysis and understanding a world that is very much designed around class dynamics. And that's why I think more than anything else, you see that the media is so out of touch with the realities that the people who are creating it are purposefully avoiding that subject and that kind of analysis. So then you're just tailing after the right wing, which is the most effective at doing that kind of politics, because even at like their height, right, they try to run away from that very very basic class politics. And people who consider themselves liberals or maybe even nominally on the left, they just have to chase after them. And I think that that plays a huge role in the kind of out of touch understanding that you get from many people in the media. Friend MDR says, I was talking to my son about labor aristocracy. It's not what I thought it meant. Could you explain it for us in Marxist terms, please? So labor aristocracy is, an up and down kind of concept in the sense that it's developed later. But effectively, it makes the argument that certain members of the trade union leadership become incorporated into the state. And effectively, they then become incorporated into the status quo. I think a good way to think about this is think about where the headquarters for American labor unions are. They're not in Detroit. They're not in Tennessee. They are in Washington, D.C. And that's because it becomes a part. This is like the philosophy. I'm just giving my fair take on it. That they become incorporated into like the state apparatus as a whole, right? Not governmental and not always in unison with it. And I think that's one thing that people get really confused about when they start to get into some of these Marxist concepts, is that all of these forces are sort of in lockstep with each other, because certainly in moments of crisis and fracturing, that incorporation becomes weaker, especially in moments of like labor militancy. But a way to think about it is, the way that the American trade movement was sort of set up to explicitly be anti-communist, right? Despite the fact that there were a lot of these kind of bottom-up socialist, communist workers' movements in this country, the leadership by rule excluded them. And that was because they wanted to play game with American capital, thinking that there could be some kind of peace if you can be in the room, in the system. And the argument about the aristocracy there is that you have people who are connected in some ways to both worlds, and they're going to choose the state and the system at large there. I think that people run wild with that theory, but I think I think people, if they're really interested in this, should read Mike Davis's book, Prisoners of the American Dream, because it breaks down a lot of this history and how we're sort of in the moment that we're at with American labor today. Got a support from the real LA. Hey, David, support from LA, Lower Alabama. Happy to hear from you. I think this is a good point, just going back to McLynch in the UK. And if you haven't seen any of this stuff, watch our episode yesterday. Matt and I went on I don't know, victory lap is a little too early, but a prolonged celebration of Lynch's media appearances. But Lou says, one refreshing thing is that Lynch calls them liars, because the government and media are lying about everything they can. And I think that that is exactly right. He cuts exactly through it. I believe it's RMT. Daredevil says, as a real Texan, how do you feel about chicken and barbecue? I think chicken barbecue is great. I make a great beer can chicken. I made some this weekend. Have you ever tried any of the new meatless items like Beyond Beef? I have. I mean, they're just very different. I'm not the biggest fan, frankly. I'm open to it. It's just every time I've had it, it's been a little nasty. David Hellman says, I really appreciate y'all's discussion of socialism and anarchism. I apologize if people got too offended by the V in the middle. You got to do that sometimes for YouTube. But reading Chomsky and Graeber recently, I've been reading Chomsky and Graeber recently, so anarchism has been on my mind. I agree that Chomsky takes some not very anarchisty positions. Yeah, I mean, Chomsky's sort of interesting with that for sure. I've never... I'm not like a huge Chomsky expert. Like, this is just like accident of like my life and history, that like I didn't go through that kind of like American lefty phase of like Chomsky being the idol. I really, I went from being on the right to being like a Marxist pretty quickly. So I sort of missed the growing up with Chomsky that I think a lot of my friends experience. But yeah, I mean, that's been my feeling too, that like, the anarchism's always been a little bit interesting and unique. And thanks for the super chat too, David. Certainly appreciate that. Let's see. Yeah, don't come at me. I'm just kidding. It's RMT. I don't know. Maybe it's the Mandela effect. I guess Strom's going up to New York City. Any places to recommend in Brooklyn? Bookstores, record stores, coffee shops, whatever. I'll be there for this ablation event this weekend. New York's a great town. I didn't like it. I don't have Rex. I'm sorry. I mean, there's a really great Greenlight bookstore is pretty good. Um, it's fun to get into the Verso Loft if you can. If the legendary Verso Loft had a lot of weird uh, social paper write ups in the past couple of years. But I mean, the best thing to do in New York City is eat Chinese food, like beyond a doubt. And that's certainly what you should be trying to get as much of as you can, because I don't know, I consider myself to be somebody who's, I eat a lot of different cuisine. I'm happy to try other, I'm not weirded out by other people's foods or anything like that. Eating Chinese food in New York was one of those moments where it's like, oh Lord, I've actually don't think I've ever had this properly before. So that was a very great experience, and that's a good place to go and hang around. And it's cheap too, which is nice. If you also on Texas, if you also see from the union, we're having leftist friends in Texas technically count as international solidarity, I'd guess so. That's not going to happen. They've been talking about that forever. That's just some people say when they get really worked up and excited. I think that it's looking more and more likely that Biden's just going to run straight up in 24. But Javier says, do you think there's any chance for Biden to take a backseat for Harris or some other Dem figure to start a long PR presidential campaign for 2024, especially if the GOP wins big this year? I don't think so. And I also think that if anything, we've been seeing more of a backseat for Harris. I think that they might be regretting the decision to bring her on the ticket because she doesn't really add that much. Just like pure, political pundit, point there. I don't think that she adds much to the ticket anymore because I think they really misunderstood her popularity. She's not a very popular political figure, except with a very, very strange online cult. Yeah, and this is a good one. I think we played a bit of this Dakota for people who are more interested in learning more about labor aristocracy. There's a great lecture on YouTube of Leo Panich talking about iron law of oligarchy. I'll see if I can find it, or if anybody else finds it and wants to share it with folks. Um, Definitely do that because it's a really strong one. Why isn't labor aristocracy not just a kind of petit bourgeois? Because of their relationship with production. I mean, they're not really in that category. Um, it's less. This is where, like, I think some of the interventions in Marxism that happened in the 1900s are really helpful, where there's a little bit more development of the theory of the state, which, by the way, was what Marx wanted to write after Capital. So Marx's work on the state was very incomplete. He didn't even finish Capital. It was put together after his death by Engels. But Marx really wanted to write a deep study of the state, and I think people who got a lot of the best interventions in the Marxist tradition in the 1900s from people like Poulantzas, from people like Miliband, Althusser, and Panich. Those people all don't agree, by the way. on the lot. But I think that that kind of investigation into the role of the state ends up becoming a really important thing for politics, because I think a lot of Marxists tend to actually have a very flat view of the state, sort of building off of what Lenin called it, like the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. And certainly the state looks out for the interests of capital, but it is not as tight of a relationship as I think sometimes Marxists imagine it to be. What the state's role in capitalism is maintaining the system for its longevity. So sometimes that does mean, like, even doing things like what FDR did, which was wage war on some aspects of capital, but with the long-term goal of maintaining the system of capitalism, right? And that's some of the development, particularly of the criticisms of social democracy, um, or laborism, as Miliband would call it, that you get later, that I think are really, really helpful for folks to work through now. If you've already worked through the class dynamic and that aspect of Marxism, really breaking down that state theory becomes really important, because I think a lot of folks have as I said earlier, just a sort of flat view of the state. Prairie Fire says, how's the Texas grid holding up? Not good. Um, every weekend it seems now that we're getting warnings that it might break down again. Luckily, it hasn't. But they haven't done very much, and it's been 100 degrees for almost 3 weeks here, which means people are cranking up the AC and demand's up. So it's very lucky it hasn't broken down yet right now. People being inflammatory and wrong in the chat. I won't even read that, but why can't I read your name? Is it Anastasia? Wants to know, how do we build a culture that makes it unpalatable and uncomfortable for corporations to attempt to engage with movements in order to exploit the brand awareness it brings? Okay, so you mean, how do we build like a movement culture that makes it just unacceptable to do brand work with corporations? I think that moving these things the groups that do that are like NGOs, and NGOs have a very different relationship to working people than do even unions or even political parties, because NGOs are just sort of, the growth of NGOs in this country was a great retreat for the left into academics, and almost of a lot of these movements from the direct goal of like coalition building into moving into these kind of structured and surveilled systems, where you pulled a lot of people out of the streets effectively on these kind of crucial issues like climate change, um, like gender depression in this country, into like think tanks and NGOs, and it ended up being very, very devastating, because again, those people become incorporated in the ruling system. Those people end up fighting for more incrementalist approaches to things, and they don't really have a radical bent to them. Plenty of people, and don't get me wrong, because I did NGO work after out of college too, so it's nothing about like the everyday person who joins these things up, but looking at them at large, it has been an attempt to try to make sure that these demands, these popular demands for change, sort of were incorporated into capital, right? Because then they have to be funded by rich people, um, and into like the government structure as a whole, right? Which is the embedding of a lot of these NGOs into sister relationships with mainly the Democratic Party, but certainly there's plenty of right wing groups out there. So, I think that's more of the problem than the culture. The reason that happens is because we don't own and control those things, right? And if you want to see that changed, I think that's where we need to be moving. Alabama white sauce. This is important. Alabama white sauce is good. No offense to our friends in Alabama. It's always a little worrying when your best BBQ thing is the sauce, but it might just be the text and me saying that. It's been weird because Alabama white sauce, I think, has become like popular nationally, and some of the stuff that I've had, especially in California and New York, does not taste like what you're getting at in Bama for sure. Christopher Kant says, Beyond Burger is one thing, meatless BBQ isn't possible for a born and raised meat loving Texan, in my honest opinion. I mean, it depends. Like, there's a good place here called Leroy and Lewis that actually does some pretty decent, like vegetarian, vegan BBQ. Smoking beets turns out really well. Smoked cauliflower is not good. I've changed my mind on that. There's stuff you can do, um, things that benefit from low and slow, but it's just like the technique is for a very specific kind of food that I think trying to replicate that doesn't always work out very well. I'm happy to see it. I think it's good. And I also like people like at Leroy and Lewis who are trying to cook different cuts of meat that aren't as popular, right? Like beef cheeks and things like that. Because one, I think that that's useful to do, and two, that is more the tradition of barbecue. I mean, like brisket was a popular barbecue meat because it was cheap and was unwanted for a lot of other things because it's tough. You have to cook it for a long time. So I think that it's good to explore other things like they're out there too, and I hope people do that more. I'm not in a union, just because I sort of work for myself. There are like journalist stuff out there. I've thought about jumping into that from time to time, but I haven't. Um, Fallout Builder says, David, is Bernie running as an independent the best shot we have at saving humankind from global climate calamity? I think so personally. Thanks. I mean, I think that a Bernie Sanders presidency would be a huge step, but no, I don't think that it's our only shot. And I think that it's important not to think in that way. One thing, like one point that I think that Leo Panish made that is really important, um, particularly with the climate question, is that we can never, no matter what, like the reality of the sciences, we can never lose our ability to think strategically about what it will take to build up the movements and the coalitions and the structure that will be necessary to transform the system. Because if we're always sort of thinking in this like 5 minutes to midnight perspective, we're never going to be able to see um, the long term rootedness that we need to make like a left wing working class movement in this country successful. Because we're always just sort of like in a panic moment. It's not to deny the urgency and the reality of this moment, but we can't lose the ability to be able to think towards the future because that really will set us back strategically. So again, I think that like a Bernie Sanders run would be great. I have some doubts about its success, and I don't think that it's actually like the most important thing right now. I think the most important thing is rerouting ourselves into class and building up our own independent left organizations that are able to exert power. And that's something that Bernie Sanders himself has said. I think that's the number one task. It's like going back to that moment. I've talked about this along the program. Bernie was always saying that, like, if I come into power, y'all are going to need to show up and, pressure the system to move and do the things that we're talking about doing here. And, a lot of people took that as a kind of rhetorical flourish. He's like, it's all of us. He's like, no, like literally, I can't do this on my own. This power is extremely limited. There's a whole state apparatus that is sort of untouched um, by the electoral system, and if we want to overcome that, we need to have an organized, class-rooted movement. And I think that building that movement is the most important thing that we can be doing, regardless of our success. People at the top, winning elections or not. All right, let me see if I can roll down. So I want to get into this Texas GOP stuff because I actually have a decent amount on that. I'll follow up, Builder. I just answered your question, but thanks for the super chat as well. I don't know if an independent run would actually merit a victory, but I do agree with the fact that like if you want to test the Bernie Sanders thesis of like being able to pull over people who might traditionally vote Republican, um, the only way you can really test that is in a general election because a Democratic primary, the voters are Democrats. Let's see. All right, I'm going to talk. I want to talk about this Texas GOP stuff. Thomas wants to know if I saw Vice. I thought Vice was good. I don't know about the politics in it, but I thought that Vice was a good movie. Saw one mama. All right, I'm going to try to get down to the very bottom and let's do some of this Texas GOP stuff. All right, let's we would love to do stuff with some of the folks in Novara. They'll apologize and tell me that they were wrong about Biden. They're doing fun stuff over there. Let's talk a little bit about this. Let's talk about this Texas GOP convention, because there's a lot in here that's, well, first of all, the convention itself, what was said in there, the planks are absolutely frightening, and I don't want to discredit that at all. I do just want to start off with a note that the Texas GOP convention is always nuts, always ridiculous, and every time they have one, it generates, sensationalized headlines. I just want to remind people of that historical context so that they're not like, oh, this, coming out like this is coming out of the blue or like a new development. This has been going on for a long while. There's no doubt, though, that this is definitely their most extreme convention and policy platform that they've ever put out. But it's just worthwhile to remember because, Daily Beast, all these people always run big pieces whenever Texas GOP has their convention, because they always do ass backward shit. But this was the first one that was in person since 2018. They rejected the 2020 elections. They called homosexuality an abnormal lifestyle choice. They rebuked John Cornyn. They called for a repeal to the 1965 Voting Rights Act. It shows that it's just a full control of the party by Donald Trump. This is not the party of Bush, and that was a horrible party in and of itself. It just shows that there's a huge shift here. And, some of the big questions are, it's like, this extremism, what will this mean for their kind of inroads in South Texas? But I don't think you can entertain that question without starting to investigate the failure of the Democratic Party in South Texas, because people who follow this, I think, follow politics a little bit closer. Of course, they talk about Texas secession. They didn't talk about the absolute failure of Operation Lone Star, which has led to the deaths now of countless National Guardsmen, including one drowning because the system, they don't even provide them with flotation devices or protocols for how to get into the water. Not to mention the billions upon billions of dollars that have just been wasted on this operation that has been an abject failure, even by the own metrics that they're putting out. It has been an absolute disaster and a waste of resources. No pushback for that. It just shows that like so much of the GOP platform is about how it's going to make you feel, right? They're against the 21 age 21 limit on buying guns like AR-15s because, quote, young people are the most likely to need to defend themselves and may need to quickly buy guns in emergencies such as riots, which is a very worrying kind of framing here. They want to require students here in Texas to learn about the humanity of the preborn child. They want to amend the Texas Constitution to remove the legislature's power to regulate the wearing of arms, right? Concealed open carry, with the view of preventing crime. And I wanted to highlight on that real quick because, of course, there are plenty of examples that you could pull up, right? From the fact that this party is waging war on the right to vote, from the fact that this party is denying the 2020 election. But it's also really notable to show that these people don't even trust our own government here, completely out of spirit with the system of government that we have in the state of Texas, which has purposefully put as much power into the hands of the legislature as possible to prevent executive overreach. And for people who might not have read it, you can read my piece in Sublation magazine about how Governor Greg Abbott has centralized power in Texas to an extent unrealizable by the founders of the state of Texas. by using COVID-19 and using executive authority that never existed historically in Texas, has been frankly unchallenged by the state legislature here, has now created a system where the governor is an extremely powerful role, which is worrying in a state like Texas, where the system was set up to prevent that exact kind of centralized executive branch government overreach, right? So they're allowing an executive authority, right, which is something that in Texas politics, political thought has always been a big fear, executive overreach, to run unchecked. And they're also saying we need to limit the ability of the branch of government here that is the closest to the people, which is the legislature. We want to limit their authority to make decisions on crucial issues like firearms and weapons in the society, right? So no democracy at the top, right? Because we're just going to let a tyrant run the state. And also, we're going to try to limit the thing that you have the most effect on, which is the legislature. Extremely anti-democratic, extremely mistrusting of Texans as a people, right? I mean, the Republican Party is certainly anti a lot of things, but they are increasingly becoming anti-Texans at large. I wanted to note that and compare that to something that Ted Cruz said on Sean Hannity, talking about the very likely incoming overturn of Roe v. Wade here.
Which is, I think the Supreme Court the next week is going to issue its decision. I think it's going to overturn Roe versus Wade. That's the right decision.
Doesn't their session end this week?
They could do it next week. So it could be tomorrow. It could be next week. We don't know for sure when the opinion will issue, but it's soon. It's within the next few days. That's the right decision. That will return the question of abortion to the elected legislatures. That's where the Constitution left it. That's where it belongs. But I think the response is exactly what you said, which is the organized left. They're going to engage in riots. They're going to engage in violence. We're going to see a reprise, I fear, of the Black Lives Matter and the Antifa riots, where they're going to try to use political violence to advance their ends. And the Department of Justice needs to step in and stop them. I halfway expect the Attorney General to be rioting alongside them because this Department of Justice has been so politicized.
Lord help us all. I mean, just on that last bit, Merrick Garland. You think Merrick Garland, of all people, is going to be out in a riot? It's despicable and ahistorical, first of all, to talk about political violence in the abortion issue. There's been one side that has been extremely violent from the get-go, and that has been a fringe evangelical right-wing movement that threatens women, that kills doctors, right? So to sit here and talk like that now in the year 2022 is absolutely absurd, though he is a master of that kind of speech. But it's also notable here where he's talking about like the state should be able to decide, when his own party platform is now saying that we don't think legislatures should be able to make these kind of decisions, right? So they want to pull things out of politics that they don't want to be decided by the people, and then throw things that are advantageous to them into politics. Just absolutely absurd. But the rhetoric here of like upcoming civil war is something that, like, I usually don't say things like this, but it is something that should worry you. The way that they're talking right now, because we're seeing more and more willingness on that side of politics here to talk in this way. And it's really worrying, and as we're going to get into one of the themes of the Texas GOP convention, that the party itself has lost control of its base. They have created something that they can't even wrangle anymore. And people like Cruz, who are just not just career politicians, just somebody who is willing to go whichever way the wind blows. This is not somebody with deeply held convictions. Those are some of the most dangerous people in moments where political violence is seemingly more and more likely to happen. Well, let's go through some of these other things on the agenda here, because they're quite striking. They also wage war on trans people, calling gender identity disorder, sorry for the language here, a genuine and extremely rare mental health condition. They are pushing civil penalties and monetary compensation to detransitioners. And they called that a form of medical malpractice. They want to change the U.S. Constitution to cement the number of Supreme Court justices at 9 and repeal the 16th Amendment of 1913, which created a federal income tax. Notable here, too, that one of the best traditions out of the Republican Party was under Lincoln with the radical Republicans, when they denied the Supreme Court, when the Supreme Court was trying to prevent the ending of slavery in this country. they call something freedom to travel, which is opposing Biden's BS milquetoast clean energy program, and they oppose California-style anti-driver policies. Something else there. Wage war on COVID-19 mandates. They want to abolish the Federal Reserve and cement the right to use cryptocurrency. But here's what's noticeable beyond so crazy, crazy times. We knew this. I think it's worth noting that the people who show up to these kind of conventions, the people who they're speaking to, is a very rabid and fringe base of even the Republican Party, but it's an organized base that certainly people like Ted Cruz are listening to. But there were some noticeable absences or limited appearances here, like Governor Greg Abbott, who's running for governor right now, only appeared at a reception on Thursday that weekend. That wasn't even like a main event of the convention, right? This is somebody who is set to maybe be the longest serving governor in Texas, somebody who holds incredible power. The Texas GOP is unwilling to confront him on his overreach or his waste or his despicable cowardice following the Uvalde shooting. He's not showing up to this. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick did speak there, but House Speaker Dave Phelan only spoke at lunch, not to the main body of delegates. And of course, they also talked about Texas seceding from the union, which is not something that you shouldn't, be worried about or consider. But I don't know. It's chest thumping stuff that we get a lot from these kind of guys. But the fact that like major figures in the Texas GOP are like, they're not even distancing themselves politically in the sense they're saying, "Oh, I disagree with this. This is getting out of control." They're just not wanted there. And I think that that's something that, we should recognize, that there are two parties in Texas, right? There's the GOP as led by Abbott and this kind of extreme right wing. Abbott's already ridiculous and out of control. But there's a fringe to his right that is growing in power and in popularity here that we need to really consider, as a direct threat here. Some things to note. I'll just pull this up for y'all. It is interesting just to remember the scope here, not to talk it down, but the scope here. Food for thought on the Texas GOP convention. John Cornyn, who was booed in the hall, received 76% of the vote in his last primary race. Greg Abbott, who didn't give a speech, received 67%. Ken Paxton, who got a standing ovation, received 43% in March, right? So that's something to remember here, that there's like an interesting disconnect between how extreme all of this stuff is getting, how worrying it is, and the relationship between that side of the GOP and the people who actually are showing up in the majority to vote, right? Abbott fended off a bunch of extreme far right Republican governor candidates in the primary, and he defeated them handily. Now, it's notable that since he's coming back into since he won the primary, he's actually picked up a lot of the extreme stuff that was put forward, notably Don Huffine's policy that he would shut down trade with Mexico. Well, Abbott did that as governor, right? He shut down trade at the border, costing the state billions of dollars, running food, and creating higher prices for Texas at grocery stores and other services across the state that then trickle down across the country, right? So they run against these guys, and then they're bringing in a lot of their stuff because they're trying to throw something towards this audience. Like, if you're trying to understand why they're doing this kind of stuff, I think it's really important to remember that they're true believers and there are cynical people who want to ride the wave. Abbott, certainly somebody who's a cynical actor who will ride the wave. When Bush was governor of Texas, Abbott was a great Bush Republican. And then Trump becomes president, and now Abbott wants to be Trump's boy, right? Those guys are going to ride whatever wave that they can. And that's really dangerous when that wave is crashing in that direction that it's going. But it's important to remember where their motivations are coming from. And in Abbott's position, why is this happening, right? These guys, like, does this make sense? People are always like, oh, does this make sense? Is Capitol not upset with these kind of things? They certainly are. And who does Abbott take orders from? He takes orders from Capitol. They donate incredible amounts of money. Abbott got millions of dollars from oil and gas industry, from electricity providers, after he did nothing after the grid collapsed, right? Millions of dollars, because they recognize that Abbott is a great tool to maintain their profits. And the spectacle stuff, the demonization of immigrants, the waste of treasure on the border, policies that are leading to deaths of guardsmen, whatever. As long as my profits are protected, these guys are a great vehicle here. But the fact is that this relationship is really tying itself to an extremely rabid, right-wing movement. And it just shows the cynicism of capital, and also that the guys who have been sort of put into this position of power, right? The Abbotts, the Phelons, they're losing control of this movement that is supposed to be the popular base, who they're appealing to. And that creates a real crisis where, even for capital, right? Where, Abbott could lose control of these guys, and we could get a Huff Hines in here who would shut down trade completely with Mexico, right? Would be absolutely devastating to capital, right? And this is a very dangerous game that they're playing even for their own kind of political security. Not to give them too much advice here, but, this stuff is getting out of control. Abbott lost control of his base. Abbott has now presented himself as the anti-COVID governor. But remember, where did that come from? Early pandemic, Texas followed the same policies as almost every other state in the country. Lockdowns, they were even going to do mail-in voting, all that kind of stuff. It was only when this right-wing movement, the kind of people who are showing up at that convention, were showing up and protesting and calling Abbott a king and a tyrant and all these things, that he then did a complete reversal on COVID policies, which led to significant deaths and destruction from COVID-19 pandemic. Now, just going into this, it's interesting to see who's winning and who's losing here. So let's pull up this. Y'all have probably seen this, but it's just worth re-upping. This is John Cornyn, and again, somebody who won 76% of his vote in the Republican primary. This is him getting booed at the convention here.
So let's take our country back, starting with Congress in November. Thank you, God bless you, and may God continue to bless our great state of Texas.
Very hopeless room there. And even one of the most psychotic and dangerous people in Congress, who they were trying to, the party, I think, was trying to prime him up for a leadership position. Dan Crenshaw. This is him getting heckled coming into the convention here. And just like, this is from a right-wing source, but, you should watch it.
I passed McCain.
Sorry, just had the way right-wingers do these kind of videos and edit them will never cease to make me laugh, though. There's a very bizarre kind of iMovie effects there.
Hey, I passed McCain. Look at I passed McCain right here. You're a rhino. You're a globalist. You're a globalist rhino. You're a globalist rhino. Kid, you're a globalist rhino. I passed McCain. I passed McCain! I passed McCain! You're a globalist rhino!
You can find more versions of that. More people than that person were coming at him, right? But it's just notable. And Dubai, Felicia says, hasn't the entire Republican establishment lost control of its base? Isn't that the one of Trump's accomplishments? Well, yes and no, because no doubt that the Republican Party at large has lost control of their base. But basically, the political movements right now, the political fight that's happening internally in the Republican Party is who's going to be able to ride that wave. DeSantis is the one who, looks very likely to shore up at least a decent amount of that. And it's just notable because, if you look at some of the gun laws that they're coming at Abbott and Cornyn for maybe supporting, they were supported, and some of them are law in Florida, right? Or he doesn't get blowback for that kind of thing because he presents himself in a way, because he plays ball with some of these guys in a way that I think Abbott and Cornyn have very much failed to do. So certainly that's a universal across the country. losing control of your base here within the Republican Party. But the fight that's happening in the Republican Party is who's going to be able to capture that. And it doesn't have to necessarily even be showing up and doing what they want you to do, as much as like just seeming like you're, on side with them. Crenshaw being presented in this way is just wild to me. I mean, obviously it's Jan 6 stuff, but that's the game that he's played. They were calling him Eye Patch McCain. And then I want to take some more questions from y'all. But let me just do one more update too of something that was also notably absent from this, which was the absolutely despicable failure of the Uvalde police to save those children in that monstrous school shooting. I mean, as y'all know, information has been sort of trickling in and out. A lot of the stuff that was reported early on was flat out false. It seems very likely that Abbott knew about this and knew when he was at that press conference that got interrupted by Beto, that he was relaying false information to the public. He's now joined in with some of the members of the Uvalde city and the police department and trying to shield the department from a full-on investigation. The Uvalde police department has gone completely rogue. They are no longer cooperating with DPS, which manages them, the Department of Public Safety. Some of the stories we're getting out here are just absolutely horrible. One of them that is just heartbreaking to think about. It's hard to have too much sympathy for police, but one of these police officers was married to one of the teachers who was shot, and she was calling him from inside the room, and he was trying to run in to help her, and the other police apprehended him, took away his gun, and detained him and prevented him from going in there and trying to save his wife. Not the only story like that, but just shows how cowardly and reckless and self-serving the police department acted in this moment. Here's the director of the Department of Public Safety here, Steve McCraw, who initially defended the police, but has now been coming out and talking about their failures. This is him testifying to the Texas Senate just last week.
That the law enforcement response to the attack at Robb Elementary was an abject failure and antithetical to everything we've learned over the last 2 decades since the Columbine massacre. 3 minutes after the subject entered the West Building, there was a sufficient number of armed officers wearing body armor to isolate, distract, and neutralize the subject. The only thing stopping a hallway of dedicated officers from entering room 111 and 112 was the on-scene commander, who decided to place the lives of officers before the lives of children. The officers had weapons, the children had none. The officers had body armor, the children had none. The officers had training, the subject had none. 1 hour, 14 minutes and 8 seconds. That's how long the children waited and the teachers waited in rooms 111 to be rescued. And while they waited, the on-scene commander waited for a radio and rifles. Then he waited for shields. Then he waited for SWAT. Lastly, he waited for a key that was never needed. The post-Columbine doctrine is clear and compelling and unambiguous. Stop the killing, stop the dying. You can't do the former unless you can't do the latter unless you do the.
Yeah, I mean, it's truly just unbelievable on a human level. I mean, you could talk about the Columbine doctrine. I mean, just the human one, knowing that children are being harmed like that, to sit outside is just, it takes something, but it ain't courage and it ain't balls, man. And, crickets on that from the Texas GOP. Just truly, absolutely despicable. Some of the things that they want to do and their cowardice in this moment here, when you're seeing just such a clear example of the real serious rot that exists in this state. that you can't do anything. You can't even do things to support like the troops, right? You can't even do things to support National Guardsmen who've been serving now on this BS Operation Lone Star, who are suffering immensely, and some of them are dying. These guys are losing their jobs. Their families are struggling. Nothing from the Texas GOP. Just an organization and a movement that certainly doesn't give, shit about minorities or queer people. And even it's becoming more and more clear that they just don't even give a shit about basic human lives in Texans across the board. So, I mean, we'll be watching this. The fault lines here. I mean, top story: Republican Party out of control. The important points for us as we're trying to build out the movement, understanding where the fractures are in the party, and recognizing that there's a division from the elected officials and some of the members of the most rabid base, which is different from the electorate and the voters that they require to win elections here. But seeing these fractions and fissures is important for us, trying to find ways to build power and to challenge their domination of the state. And what else can be said about Uvalde at this point that hasn't at this point? Just like a superhuman level of cowardice, something that is just truly sometimes hard to fathom. Well, how about this? I want to do this Colombia story too with y'all, and then why don't we take some questions after that? That sounds good to y'all. Because I promised that we'd cover this. Gustavo Petro, former left-wing guerrilla fighter, former mayor of Bogota, won the presidential election in Colombia, which is an absolutely huge victory. I mean, this is a country that's been dominated by the right wing throughout its entirety of its modern history, and a lot of that role comes with the power of elites in that society, but also a lot of American influence in trying to use them as a cudgel against left working class movements across South America, Latin America at large. The person he ran against was one of these people who's pushing this kind of anti-corruption politics. And remember, a lot of times anti-corruption politics is how you obscure what your actual policies are, right? Because you can just rail against the government without having to put forward a strong public program. He's a slumlord builder who praised Hitler, and it's very good that Gustavo Petro defeated him. On Gustavo Petro, this is from the Financial Times, investors worry his pledges to raise taxes, impose trade tariffs, and shift the economy from oil mining towards tourism and agro industry spell the end of the country's appeal as a place to do business. It's a very soft way to say that rich people aren't too happy with this person coming into power. It's notable, though, that what Petro is inheriting in similar ways to what we've seen in other countries where left-wing governments have come into power is a country whose finances are in complete shambles. So he's inheriting an extremely high public debt, I believe something like 64% of the entire GDP of the country, which means that there's going to be these kind of vultures. There's going to be these kind of pushes to get World Bank, IMF folks in there to undermine these policies. Some of the economic policies that he ran on were to raise taxes on wealthier people, and also to levy unproductive large rural estates to increase GDP. He wants to impose tariffs, basic sovereign country stuff, impose tariffs to protect domestic producers. He also wants to renegotiate trade deals that were negotiated by the right-wing governments of the past with the United States, which is, you desperately need to do because the deals are extremely unfair and harmful to workers. And he also wants to employ the unemployed by offering government jobs. Difficulties that he's going to face is, even though he won this election, his coalition only holds around 15% of seats in the government. Now, other left parties may join, but it means that the legislative branch is still going to be dominated by conservatives who are going to be absolutely hostile to his move. I don't say this to sour the mood, but just to understand that, these fights are going to be ongoing, and understand the conditions as we're starting to see things go up. Reopening diplomatic relations between Colombia and Venezuela is an absolutely historic and important moment, and it's very it's very good that that's going to be on the agenda. It means that people can find peace and community that has been denied to them by the harshness of U.S. proxy politics there. So if nothing else, if that was the only thing that was achieved, that would be a hell of a thing to achieve. But just to give people a sense of poverty in Colombia, this is some stats from the CERP. Colombia's GDP per capita in 2019, before the pandemic, was $15,600. This is about the same as Brazil. But Colombia has a much higher level of extreme policy, which is defined as people living under $1.90 a day, right? It is 6.4% as compared with Brazil, which has 4.1% extreme poverty, which means that there's 56% more people, 1.17 million, fell into extreme poverty in Colombia as compared to the number who would have done so if Colombia had the same rate of extreme poverty as Brazil. And the country's income inequality is the worst in Latin America. So there's going to be an uphill battle. But this move is extremely important and extremely encouraging, especially as we're seeing this leftward shift across the region. Hopefully, and it's looking very likely, Lula is able to come back into power. Being able to build up a bloc of left-wing run countries to be able to organize against American hegemony in the region, to be able to renegotiate the social deal with the ruling classes in those societies to the benefit of working people. I mean, there's a lot of promise here. And just the fact that Petro was able to break out of this decades-long control of right-wing parties in Colombia is historic enough on its own. But he's really building it off of a sustained criticism of the current state of political economy in the country and challenging the extreme inequality that has come after decades upon decades of right-wing pro-American government there. And we wish him nothing but success and are hoping to be able to cover some positive stories when he officially takes the office. I also just want to briefly, before I take questions at the end, and look at Ecuador for a second, where there have been sustained protests led mainly by indigenous movements against the horrific anti-human draconian economic policies of Ecuador's president, Guillermo Lasso. The demonstrations began on June 14th, and some of the demands are that gasoline prices be cut by 45 cents a gallon to $2.10, plus price controls on agricultural products that are used as staples in the country, and a larger budget for education. Now, remember, so solidarity and support for the protesters there. Remember the context of how all of this ended up happening in the country, where you had a pretty exciting election where a really great left-wing candidate, Oroz, was up against Guillermo Lasso. And there was a spoiler candidate there, Yaku Perez. And if people want more information on this, Matt and I covered that extensively as this was going on. You can find it in our international coverage playlists on our YouTube channel. Yaku Perez is somebody who comes out of a kind of NGO, PMC movement, trained and educated in the U.S. Nothing necessarily wrong with that. I believe Oroz also went to school in the U.S. But it was somebody who was very much incorporated into this kind of squishy neoliberal progressivism. And he actually, facing the brutality and the reality, which everybody knew was going to come with the Lasso government, he actually encouraged his supporters to spoil their ballots going into the election. So did not show up in support of the left in that election because he was sour because he lost. And frankly, opened up the door for Lasso to come into power, because the election was I think 5 or 6 percentage points, but really, really damaging. And I'm not gonna, I don't have this download, so I can't play the sound here. But this is a tweet here, and I'll play a little bit of the video. Former presidential candidate Yaku Perez did not receive a warm welcome during protests in Ecuador. Yaku, who came close to making it to the runoff, called for a spoiled ballot, making Lasso's path to victory easier. And this is Perez showing up at the protest. I don't know if y'all can hear the sound, but he's being booed and heckled by the crowd, challenging him for showing his face in a moment like this. So interesting stuff going on across the board in South America and Latin America right now, and hopefully some kind of fractures and opportunities for the left. We're seeing a resurgent movement right now. It's really encouraging. The victory in Colombia is absolutely historic and encouraging, and hopefully they can be joined by Lula da Silva and start to chart out a path for real independence from American dependence and American hegemony in the region. But it's going to be a big ass fight, frankly. It's going to be a big fight because the power of capital in those societies is very much entrenched. The opportunity for these things to backslide, especially given the conditions, like, for example, in Colombia, where you're inheriting mass amounts of debt, mass amounts of inequality. There's a lot of potential for backslides, and you have to build up a sustained movement that understands what is immediately available to you if you're going to be able to push through. But yeah, I'd be happy to. I'll scroll up just a little bit, but if y'all want to just re-up your questions, if I missed any, I'd be happy to take a few at the end here. Also, remember, Matt, I think, is going to be coming on around 7 Central tomorrow for a Left Reckoning stream, which I'm always happy to see him do those as well. But yeah, I'll take a couple questions before we roll them. I got a little bit of time here. A friend here, Left is Best. Thanks for the super chat. Says Romaro Sebastian Funes's YouTube channel has great coverage on all Latin American socialist movements. Maybe have him on. I'll check him out. I'm not familiar with that, but I'll give that a look. And thanks for the chat for sure. I don't think that the United States government has the capacity to promote another kind of condor operation. That doesn't mean that they're not going to try destabilization efforts, but I don't know. I don't think they're organized as much as they were in the 70s. Should I go undercover at the Cato Institute? They have an internship opening. Go for it, man. I think the probability of burnout is very, very high. Better way to communicate, defund the police. I mean, I think that, recognizing that, there are parts of the country where people want there to be more accountability when they do need somebody to show up to deal with the situation is something that, the left needs to get better at understanding. Also understanding why police budgets are so high in this country. It's not solely just because of like a love of the police. It's because it's the cheapest budget line, the cheapest button that cities and even states can pursue, right? Like the over-reliance on policing in this country comes out of cuts to the social good, cuts to the public tax revenue, right? Like there's a connection, for example, when Travis County here in Texas negotiates a deal with one of the wealthiest people in the world to give him millions upon millions of dollars in tax breaks, and the over-reliance of the Austin City Council on policing to deal with crises of poverty, crisis of unemployment, things like that, right? And that's where the connection is. That's where the chain is. And if we want to break that, it has to come from a very holistic understanding of why governments do this, because I hate to burst folks' bubble. I talk about this at length on This is Revolution with Pascal and Jason and Gene and Marcus. But the difficult reality is that when we say things like, defund the police, fund this, fund that, certainly move the money around, cut the police budget, it's out of control. But even if you tally up all of the police spending in this country, it's nowhere near, what a housing program would be, or an education, like refunding our education system would be, or things like Medicare for all. And I don't say this to say that like pushing back against out of control police budgets is wrong or that we shouldn't pursue it. But I think that like a lot of people, there was like this version of the slogan that made it seem like it was a simple fix and sort of missed the reason that these bloated police budgets have come into being. And it's because it's the only tool that local governments sort of have right now to use, and they're willing to do it. So it's not about them letting them off the hook, but it's understanding the kind of political economy as to why in the United States, city governments rely on using the police to terrorize and harass poor and working class people. So I think like there needs to be a lot of reckoning with like that reality to be able to build a successful movement that's able to speak to all these kind of things. I haven't followed this race closely. What are your thoughts on Michelle Viejo? She's a progressive that advanced in Texas 15 district by the border. This is a district that Republicans want to flip. I haven't followed that race as closely as I should, so I don't have anything off the cuff. But I mean, it's very worrying, and I think that we can't treat South Texas, the Texas Democratic Party can't treat South Texas as just a give me. Because we're seeing more and more that people are realizing the Democratic Party doesn't show up for them and they don't respect them. So I hope that progressive candidates are the ones who are able to sort of break through this, because I think just as a narrative shift, it would be very, very effective versus this kind of like really baseless identity politics stuff. Because one, like that's a silly way to think about politics. And two, it's just absurd that the Democrats thought that the Republicans were never going to be able to recruit Tejano and Hispanic candidates to run in those districts. You need to offer people more, and I hope more progressives are the ones who are able to break through. But again, I haven't followed that race closely enough to talk about at length, but definitely want to do more about that as we're getting closer to the election there. Daredevil says, David, when we do a gaming stream, I recommend you play XCOM when you do, call it the Griscom stream. That sounds fun. I mean, I don't know if I have the skills to do a gaming stream. One, because I think I'd be too embarrassed, people seeing that I'm bad, and two, because like I like to play these like grand history games that I'm also not very good at. So it might be a little boring, and the people who know how to play those games are probably just going to end up getting mad at me. But we'll see. Maybe sometime. Matt and I played a 2K stream a while, like a year and a half ago during COVID, and he kicked my ass. Good to hear from you, Infinite Content. Hey, Gris, long time no see. I've been seeing some stories about banks contracting their mortgage departments, the housing bubble about to burst. Well, I think it's important to remember that not what happened 2008, 2009 financial crisis, right? Because that came out of a lot of the weird financial products that were tied to mortgage-backed securities. But banks are pulling those back because when interest rates go up, the amount of people who are qualified or that they're going to lend to is extremely limited. There's certainly going to be some level of a correction. I don't know if that will necessarily mean that prices are going to go down as much as prices aren't going to continue to skyrocket like they have, like in Austin, they've just exploded over the past couple of years. There's definitely going to be a slowdown in house buying in this country. There's no doubt about it. And that's why you're seeing banks restrict their mortgage operations. Did you see AMLO offer asylum for Assange and call out U.S. hypocrisy? Also played WikiLeaks footage of U.S. war crimes. Yeah, we did. We played that with Chip Gibbons yesterday. You might be interested in checking that out. But no, we haven't. I mean, like, there's something to be said about what AMLO's been doing. He's also called the U.S. blockade of Cuba genocidal. It will be interesting as we talk with Danny Bessner and Derek Davison to see how much this goes from rhetoric into policy. He's certainly up against a whole lot, so you have to temper your expectations there. But I mean, standing up for Assange there is extremely encouraging, no doubt about it. Does Matt have his own channel now? No, Matt's still here. Left reckoning. He's just doing streams on Fridays, which I'm happy to see him join up doing these because they're a lot of fun. It's good hearing from everybody. All right, let's see. What's your strategy when playing Sid Meier's Civilization? Dude, I'm too nostalgic. I always play as the Romans because I hate playing games like that and being like America in like the Middle Ages. It just always feels like ridiculous. I've tried to play those games like Victoria and what was the other one, Iron Hearts, but I can't be fucking reading and like studying before I play a game. I'm a little lost right now when it comes to game. I don't have something that's been speaking to me. There we go. We could do this. What if I had a Marxist fishing live stream show on Twitch? Strom, you're a pretty good angler, aren't you? I'm all right. I love to do it though. And this is exciting. Our friend Fidel Kalanko, apologize if I'm getting that wrong. It is looking like there will be a strike wave in Norway this summer and fall. We see more militancy from workers worldwide now, and what can be done to capitalize on this willingness of workers to fight? I mean, I think the first thing you can do is to support active movements. We're going to talk. We're going to release this conversation we had with one of the organizers here at Starbucks. I think the best thing you can do from the outside is try to, literally, probably one of the few times that like a lot of social media activity can be really, really helpful because you bring these things in front of people and they realize like, I can do this, right? And that's something that's very encouraging. I do think that we're starting to see more militancy. These UK strikes have been nothing short of inspiring, and we'll see if Royal Mail joins up with them too. I think a lot of people are realizing, there's a kind of limitation on politics as it's currently situated. They're taking matters in their own hands, and there's something phenomenal about that because it takes away the middleman that sort of breaks through that. What about a Griscom grilling stream? Well, we never got there. I mean, I'd like to get there soon. We've been sitting at like 900 patrons for like 9 months, but when it hits 1,000, Matt's coming to Austin. We're doing a grill stream. So if you want to see that happen, subscribe at patreon.com/lovereckoning. Gaming stream 2 of you with Emma plus $50 on the line might be funny. Yeah, I'd be down for that. I don't know. Is Emma a gamer? Now, if we played FIFA, I'd kick Matt's ass. There's no doubt about that. I'm a good FIFA player. I played way more FIFA than I've played 2K in my life. Let's see. Infinite constants. In honor of Michael, you should play as the Caliphate and spread the Prophet's message and conquer these Yakubian devils. Allahu Akbar. There you go. That's an idea. We'd be happy to get Emma on. It's always sitting there. I know, like, it's always funny when you spend a lot of time with somebody at work, like Matt does. It's funny to bring them on your show, but I love talking to Emma, so we're happy to bring her on. All right, I think this will be the last one of the night. What's your preferred type of steak? I think ribeye by far. It's the best by far. Y'all, I will be back. I'm going away this week. I'm going to New Mexico, actually. But I'll be back for the show next Wednesday. I won't be back for Griscom show on Tuesday, so I guess I'll do it on Thursday. Next week, we have a really great conversation with one of the organizers here in Austin of the Starbucks Workers United. And we'll also be joined by Lee Phillips, who is going to be talking about eco-austerity and how to push back against that movement. Also, we're going to do an explainer and a defense of nuclear power. I think that's going to be really fun to share with you all. I'll just, as people might know, I was somebody who was converted on nuclear power. I used to be really against it. I've educated myself on it and think that it's actually a very crucial part of any kind of serious climate program, particularly one that's rooted in workers' power and not just kind of mass devastation for working people. So I'm really excited to share that conversation with y'all. This weekend, we're going to be joined by Andrew Perez of The Lever for patrons, patreon.com/leftreckoning, who is going to be talking to us about Joe Manchin and I'm sure a few other topics. It's always great having Andrew on the program. But until then, y'all, I'll see y'all next week.